Okay. Welcome to this workshop for the Polish Schools Debating Championships on burdens and prep time. My name is Pailo Moyo Mangondo, and I'll be one of the CAs for the debating championships. So as indicated in the title, really what I want to focus on in this particular workshop is doing burdens, establishing what they are, why they are important, and how to approach prep time and preparing for all kinds of debate topics in general by first analyzing the burdens. So before we start with that, I think a really important question is what's the first thing that you should do whenever you get a motion or a topic at a debating competition? And I think one of the first things that you ought to identify with the motion is what sort of motion is it? What kind of motion are we discussing, and what sort of issues are being dealt with? Before I continue, if you've got any questions, please feel free to send them to me and I'll answer them as best as I can during the live stream. Okay, so I think the first thing that you have to do is really identify the type of motion that you are doing. And we've got broadly two main types of motions. The first type of motion is your change motion. And those motions, the motions where you are creating a change in the way in which the world works. And sometimes you are changing a hypothetical world, but you're still changing how that world works. So, typically those motions are this house would motions, though sometimes they can be this house believes that or this house regrets. So for example, this house would legalize the sale of human organs. This house would legalize or ban school uniforms depending on which part of the world you are from. This house would legalize marijuana. So your change motions, you are changing how the world works. So for example, in the legalizing marijuana debate, there is currently in a number of places in the world, the sale and the consumption of marijuana is illegal. So you are changing that. You're making a change to the world currently that we call the status quo, and we make it and we change it to this new world where we have marijuana legal. The second type of motion that you would have to engage with at any debating competition is a this house believes that motion, or this house supports or this house regrets. And that type of motion is what we often call a normative or an evaluative debate. In that case, you aren't focusing on changing how the world works, but you're looking at a set of norms or a set of values by which you choose to analyze the world and choose either why you think those norms and values are important, okay, or whether or not a proposition or an opposition team is better able to achieve those norms and values. Okay, great. So examples of motions could be this house believes that the United Nations has failed in its mandate. Okay, so in that case, you aren't changing the world in any way. What you're simply doing is evaluating if the UN has failed. Or another example could be, this house regrets the rise of female pop stars as feminist role models. In that case, you aren't necessarily arguing for a change. You can't argue for a change. What you're doing is evaluating, right? You are evaluating whether or not female pop stars as feminist role models has been a good or a bad thing. So we can try do this a little bit by example, I would suggest. Using some of the motions that you've received for PSDC this year. So one of your prepped motions has been this House would replace trial by judge with trial by jury in Poland. So in that case, the status quo, or what the world is like currently, is that there are judges that are used in determining criminal cases in Poland. And the change that you are suggesting is that you would make it a trial by jury. So people are tried by a jury of their peers. Or this House, another prepped motion that you have, this House would not allow universities to use standardized tests or exit level exams as a component of their admissions process. In that case, universities currently use standardized tests or exit level exams, right? So I guess in Poland, I think that's the matura. And so what you would say is universities are no longer allowed to use that for their admission process. They have to use something else. Okay, an example of a normative or evaluative motion could be this House believes that the EU should require member states to aggressively censor fake news on social media platforms. But that particular motion is a little bit tricky. It's a bit of a mixture of both of those, because while it believes that motion, it does require a change to how the world works. Okay. So once you've identified the type of motion, this shouldn't take particularly long. What you really should spend a few minutes talking about is discussing what are the burdens in the debate. What are you expected to do as a proposition and an opposition team, right? So I think that's where a lot of teams miss it, because they don't really analyze what is their responsibility as a prop or an op in the context of this particular debate. So let's start. Once you've identified each type of motion that is available to you, what you then need to do is establish what are the things that you ought to do as a team in order to win that debate. What is the expectation of you in the context of that debate? And I think there are different strategic steps that you would take depending on the type of motion that you're going to be arguing. Let's start with the first type of motion, I'll change debates. There are generally 4 things that a proposition team is expected to do in a change debate. The first thing is that they need to prove a harm or a problem with the way in which the world works. So you need to identify what the problem is, right? And the problem needs to be compelling enough so that people believe that a change is warranted in the way in which the world works. So for example, if the motion was this House would legalize the sale of human organs, your problem really is going to be about how there's currently a shortage of organs in the status quo, and that people are struggling to find organ donors. There aren't enough incentives for people to donate their organs. And so that means that people who are in desperate need of organs are stuck in hospitals, cannot get life-saving operations, and ultimately lose lives. So they're identifying the problem. The second thing that you then need to do is show that your change will affect the problem, right? And so remember that the change you're talking about is the model or the policy you are identifying. The model or the policy you are identifying. Now, here's where you have to be careful. Sometimes the motion itself is the model or the policy, right? Sometimes you have to add a little bit more detail. And sometimes the motion suggests what your policy should be, and then you just need to add a few more details. So an example of this is actually your first prepped motion for PSDC. This house would replace trial by judge with trial by jury in Poland. In that case, what you have to do is identify what is the problem with the criminal justice system in the world today, particularly in Poland, and then your solution or your model is given to you in the motion. So in this case, you have to use trial by jury as your solution to a problem of a system with trial by judge. Okay. Once you've done that, you then need to, the third step that you must follow in your burden is to show that your policy will have a positive effect, and that it either fixes the harm you've identified. So it must fix the problem, or it prevents it from happening, or at the very least, it mitigates the harm. So it doesn't solve all the problems, but it does mitigate the harm. Okay. And there you have to be a bit realistic, because a lot of the time, not all of your policies are going to solve every single problem and every single harm. And this is where you need to be conscious and cautious about that. Don't build policies and models to solve everything. Solve what you can within the confines or within the realm of the debate. The fourth and final step to this is that you need to show, because any change that you create, sorry, I'm now switching between thoughts, but any change that you create must and will always have spin-off effects. It will have other impacts. And so what you need to show is that the spin-off effects that you get do not negatively impact, right, the problem that you've identified. Because if they exacerbate, or rather, to put it simply, if they make the problem worse, then you are failing in your burden. Okay? And also, second thing is that you need to show that any benefits that accrue from your policy or your model are going to outweigh any of the harms that come as a result of its implementation. And I think this is a very important part of the burden for two reasons. One, because it shows that you are more nuanced and you understand that no singular policy is going to fix everything, and that sometimes there are bad things that we must accept will happen, but we trade them off for very good things. Okay, and I think the second thing is that it just appears more realistic for the judges. The judges are likely to credit people more when they sound a little bit more realistic. So let's try come up with an example. And a good example for such a motion would be, this house would legalize the sale of all drugs. Okay. In this instance, your first step, remember, is to show that there is a problem that requires fixing. So in this case, what you want to say is that, the criminalization of drugs has done far more harms than it has done good, right? So it means that people don't seek treatment, people are ostracized, it has allowed for a rampant black market and illegal trade, that has allowed for secondary industries to be associated with it. So think about the fact that drugs and the drug trade isn't an isolated industry. There are other trades which are associated with it, be it things like human trafficking, prostitution, arms trade. So it's very rarely an isolated industry. Okay. The second thing is that you need to show that the policy or the change you are suggesting will have an effect on the harm. So in this particular motion, what you want to say is if we legalize or if we allow for the legal sale of all drugs, we limit all of the harms that we've identified in the problem, be it the secondary industries, talking about rates of addiction, people not seeking help and rehabilitation. The third step, apologies, is that you want to show the effect will be positive, okay, and you prevent, mitigate, or fix the harm. So in this case, what you want to do is that you want to show the link between your model, okay, and reducing the harms that you've identified. Apologies for that. So reducing those harms that you've identified. And finally, you're talking about spin-offs and weighing off harms versus benefits. Okay, and this is where you make the points that show, apart from reducing the harms or making an impact from making an impact on all of the things that you've identified in the problem, that there are no secondary effects that would occur, or that those secondary effects are less important than your primary benefits that you would achieve in that instance. So the harms or the benefits outweigh the harms. Okay. So that's focusing on prop in a change debate, the 4 steps that I mentioned. The next thing to talk about is op in a change debate. Now, op often has several different alternative options that they can choose, and they have to be very careful about which alternatives they do end up choosing and how they choose to run them. Sometimes they're a bit contradictory to each other. So the 4 steps for op are as follows. The first thing is that when addressing the problem, op has 3 strategies they could follow. The first strategy they could do is to suggest that there is no problem, or the problem isn't as bad as the proposition team suggests it is. Now, there's a bit of a, I guess, there is a trick with this strategy in the first part of the burden, which is that there is no guarantee that there is no problem. And I think often people who set debate motions, especially change debates, often set those debates with a problem in mind. And so it's very difficult to contest the problem, but sometimes there's room to do so. Okay. The second thing is that you could say, well, this might be a problem, but really the harm is somewhere else. And so this policy isn't going to fix that particular harm, okay? And then the third strategy is to say, well, we agree with the problem. This isn't a contentious arena in the debate, and you don't need to spend too much time on this. The second step is when you're engaging with whether or not the policy or the model will change or affect the harm. Okay, so here the opposition's burden is to show that the change does not affect the harm, or to show that the change affects the problem in a very different way to how proposition had suggested. Okay, so here you don't contest the problem. Here you're contesting the solution and where the effect is. Okay. Then the third step, which is a natural progression of this, is that the solution or the model will actually have a negative impact on the initially identified harm. Okay, so here you're saying, well, it's fine if that happened. You're not saying it's fine. You're just saying that the problem is going to be worse when such a model is implemented. And finally, the fourth step is talk about the secondary effects or the spin-off effects. And here you also have to do the weighing to say that the harms that we get, the bad things that come out of this policy are much, much worse than any of the benefits, or worse than the benefits that we accrue from this particular policy. Okay, so let's do this by way of example. I won't choose the drug motion. Instead, I will choose legalizing the sale of human organs and lighting. Just doing weird things. So for the legalizing the sale of human organs, in this case, the first step around the problem, a property opt team could suggest that there is no problem that requires solving. It's a very, very difficult strategy in that particular motion, particularly because, I think it's quite intuitive to say that a lot of the time there's a shortage of organ donors in various different parts of the world. The second part is to then say, well, show that a change will not affect the harm, or that the change will have a different effect to how prop suggested that it would. So in this case, you say legalizing the sale doesn't necessarily mean more people will want to donate organs, right? So it's not a big enough of an incentive, and there could be reasons for that. Or what you would want to say is that potentially legalizing the sale would make the organ donor shortage even worse. And one might be inclined to say as an argument, well, the people who otherwise would have been donating freely are more likely to just donate, to sell their organs as an alternative. Okay. Then the third thing is to show that the effect will be negative and worsen the harm, or have no impact on that harm. So in this case, for this motion, what you would want to do is show a link between legalizing the sale of human organs and then showing how it necessarily makes it much worse in the organ donor system in that regard. And finally, you talk about the spin-off effects. So you would say any possible benefits or marginal benefits that prop could gain from some people donating more to the or selling their organs is set off by a number of harms. And it could be things like it entrenches the black market. It could be things such as, now I forgot this point in my head. It could be things such as, okay, we'll focus on, I'll just leave it at entrenching a black market, or resulting in people bidding for organs as opposed to the actual sale, because it's such a rare commodity. And then because of price increase, it just means that the rich are the only ones who are able to buy the organs. That's what I meant. Okay. So think about that. For your prepped motions, you've got 3 this house would motions that you can make use of in this regard, and you can think about. So this house would replace trial by jury, or trial by judge with trial by jury in Poland. This house would not allow universities to use standardized tests or exit level exams as a component of their admissions process, or this house would privatize prisons. Really good. It will be useful to use this particular strategy in prepping for those, for the cases for those motions. The next type of motion and how we should deal with that, our burdens, is that this house will not necessarily, this house believes that, but rather our evaluative debate. So we need to evaluate a debate in that instance. And I think the really important thing about these types of motions is that we have to establish a value metric by which we assess this motions. So there's a set of principles, there's a standard by which we choose to evaluate or look at this motion. And if we are able to achieve or meet each of those standards, then it means that the team that meets them is best in that particular round. Okay. Sometimes it will be a single standard or criteria to think of. In other instances, it is a set of criteria to look at. So let's look at what are the steps or your burden of proof in this case in an evaluative motion. From proposition, 4 things that need to be done. The first thing is you should identify what are the issues at play. Why are we having this discussion? Very similar to a problem setting in a change debate. And sometimes it might even be the problem setting in the change debate. The second thing is you then create a criteria. So these are the criteria that we're using to evaluate or assess this particular debate. And it's really important for prop teams to do that. If prop teams don't do that adequately, op teams sweep up and take the opportunity to take it from them. The third thing is that speakers need to then measure each of their arguments against that particular criteria or set of standards. Okay, so the purpose of creating the metric is to evaluate the debate. So all of the arguments must be geared, should focus, should try and meet that criteria or the metric. And then finally, what you then do is you say, if you have fulfilled the metric of the debate. So how is it that you achieve or meet the criteria that have been established? Okay, so we can do this by way of example. I think the example that I'm going to use is this house believes that this house believes that the rise of female pop stars has done more harm than good for the feminist movement. Okay, so in essence, this debate, the real main issue at play is identified in the motion, right? So here, the debate is about female pop stars and their impact on the feminist movement, right? And if that has been a net good or bad. Then the metric that you could use for this debate could be that the actions of female pop stars are good for the feminine, or do more good than harm for the feminist movement when it creates greater exposure, it creates greater awareness, it makes it more accessible, and so on. So that's how you then measure the success or failure of female pop stars for the feminist movement in particular. Okay. Then the third step is that any argument, any piece of positive matter or substantive material that you generate in this motion, you then need to show or show that they meet the criteria that you've identified, be it accessibility, be it more knowledge, more awareness of the feminist movement, bringing it into the mainstream, all of those things. All of the arguments then need to be directly linked to that particular criteria and prove various parts of that criteria. Okay, and then finally, you need to show that the metric is fulfilled or your criteria is fulfilled. So in this case, it's often a statement or a summary that you would make at each of the speeches, at the end of each of the speeches, where you say, well, because we have been able to show that feminist role models ultimately create more accessibility for the feminist movement, that means that we show it does more harm, more good than it does harm, or harm than good. Okay, I'm confusing words a little bit there. So there you are showing that you've achieved the metric of the debate, the way that we've chosen to evaluate, the criteria that determines who wins this particular debate. Okay, so that's propositions strategy for burdens, those 4 steps: issues, criteria, measuring the criteria, and showing that the criteria are fulfilled. Then op, on the other hand, has 4 sets of burdens that they ought to follow. The first one is that they need to accept propositions' identification of issues at play, or they need to say, well, we don't agree these are the issues which are really at play. We've got our own set of separate issues. And let's see if we can get this lighting working again. Okay. And it's not working. Okay, I'll be a dark figure for now. So they can either identify their own issues, or they can say, well, we agree with what proposition has said. This part of the debate is not contentious. The second thing is that they can, when relating to the criteria of the debate, they can either, one, say, we think the criteria from proposition is correct, so we're going to debate them on that criteria or metric. Or they can say, we think the criteria is incomplete and requires some addition. Or the third thing is they can say, well, the criteria is entirely wrong. This is how you should analyze or evaluate the debate. Now, the problem with that particular strategy is, is that it makes the debate a lot more messier, because then not only are you trying to disprove arguments, you're also trying to disprove entire metrics of the debate. The third thing is that you then need to measure your arguments against the criteria that you've created. And the fourth and final step is that you need to show how proposition has not managed to fulfill the criteria as identified. Okay, so those are the 4 main steps that need to be followed. Okay, so let's try and do this by way of example. And I think the example I'm going to select in this particular instance will be, this house believes that the media, this house believes that the media has gone too far in invading private or privacy, rather. Okay, so let's start with the first step, identifying the issues at play. So what you would, as an opposition, you would probably say that this motion is about privacy and one's right to privacy, and presumably a prop would accept that. And in this case, then it shouldn't be contentious, and opposition would probably agree with that. The second step about accepting, rejecting, expanding the criteria of the debate Presumably a prop team would identify that this debate is probably going to be about, privacy should not be invaded if it creates a harm or if it has unfair benefits on particular groups, or if it is, principally unjust to limit or invade one's privacy, right? So those three things. Opposition, in that instance, could choose to accept those criteria and say that this is a fair means of looking at, evaluating the debate, or they could say, well, we don't think it's correct, we think it's something else. I think it's likely that those are the accepted criteria. The third thing on measuring your arguments against the criteria is going to be very similar to what you've done from proposition. So here you would make any arguments to prove the criteria in your favor as an opposition team. And then the fourth part, showing how proposition does not fulfill the metric, what you can say is that because prop doesn't prove why the right to privacy is so important or valuable, and does not show why invasion of privacy creates such significant harms, right? Then the metric is not fulfilled in the debate and opposition should take it. Okay. And so in this case, you would justify why it's okay to invade privacy, or why privacy as a right isn't an absolute right that should be respected, particularly by the media as people who, or as an institution that is responsible for bringing light and truth to issues. Okay. So now we've looked at burdens. We should be able to do burdens for change debates from both proposition and opposition, and we should be able to do burdens for evaluative debates from both proposition and opposition. The next thing that we then need to discuss is how are they addressed in a debate, okay? And I think there's the implicit ways and the explicit ways. In general, for explicit ways, it's really important for your proposition teams and your opposition teams to speak about what their burdens are. So explicitly stating the criteria that are used in evaluative debates, explicitly stating what your burden is, particularly for change debates. And ideally, the burdens should be identified by the first prop and the first op. Okay, so prop should say, in this debate, we as proposition are going to prove these three things. And I think that's really good, because once you've done that, you ultimately give judges a roadmap by which they could follow, similar to a signpost, but signposting. But I think it's in some ways more important than signposting, because signposting, I think, is more aesthetic and gives more clarity, whereas establishing burdens is far more important because it's dealing with what things that you actually need to do to win the debate. So in order to win this debate, proposition is going to prove 1, 2, 3 things. 1, there's a problem in the status quo. 2, that our policy will affect that problem. 3, any benefits that we accrue from our policy outweigh any of the harms, in particular secondary harms. Then, opposition should probably do the same, and opposition needs to do that round about the time that they're establishing the clash. Okay, so remember that a clash is expected. First opposition is expected to state and deliver what the clash is. This is where we disagree. This is the point of disagreement between us in opposition and us in proposition. And our burden is to prove 1, 2, 3. So keep those things in mind. Okay, how that manifests tangibly is as follows. The first speaker of proposition is always expected to generate the problem in the debate for a change motion. So for change debates, Prop 1 is expected to provide us with a problem. This is the problem with the status quo, and they're also expected to deliver a model. Okay, so presumably, while they're delivering the model, they're delivering the second part of the burden, which is that making a change or using our policy will affect the harm. So some kind of argument about effectiveness. Then the third thing about mitigating, fixing, or preventing the harm, presumably Prop 1 has to do this, Prop 2 has to do this, Prop 3 should also do this. Okay, so this is something that everyone is expected to do, though the burden is explicitly stated by first proposition. And finally, talking about the secondary effects or weighing up benefits versus harms, that tends to be more developed, and so that tends to happen later on in the debate in second prop. Third prop will obviously have to do a little bit, and prop reply will also have to do a bit of that to extend the debate further. Okay. In terms of the opposition team and who's going to be doing what in the debate in terms of the burdens, I think it's quite clear that any attack on the harm is probably going to be, it has to be dealt with by Op 1. So if you choose to accept the problem, that is fine. Make it clear. We agree that this is the problem. But if you want to attack the harm, if you want to say that it's a different problem, it's Op 1's responsibility to do it. Because Prop 1 does it, Op 1 should probably do it directly afterwards to make it very, very clear. And then if you want to attack any of the effectiveness, right, or the benefits of the effectiveness of the policy, or in its ability to address the actual harm, you have to make sure that Op 1 is also doing this. They need to make sure they're doing this. Then this next two parts of the burdens for change motions, so about the negative effects being worse on the harm or any spin-offs, are probably going to be dealt with by second speakers, although first Op will probably have to deal with negative effects of the policy as well. It's really important that they talk about, well, here's this model that's been suggested by Prop 1. Here are the harms that we gain from this policy. Okay. So that deals with change debates. Let's look at normative and evaluative motions. Okay, so in this case, presumably on both sides, anything that deals with the issues at play, anything that deals with the main topics in the debate are probably going to be dealt with by the first proposition and first opposition speakers. So prop identifying what is the main issue of the debate, op choosing to accept it, reject it, or identify other issues at play. In addition, the criteria that is used to evaluate or analyze the debate is also going to be dealt with by the first proposition and first opposition speakers, because that's their primary role. Then, all speakers in the debate will need to measure their side's substantive material, their positive matter, their arguments against that metric. So the first speakers are going to be doing that. The second speakers are probably going to do that. The third and the reply speakers will also have to do a little bit of that. And then, in terms of showing whether or not the metric is fulfilled, presumably all speakers need to also address that as well in a normative or evaluative debate. Okay. So I hope that bit makes sense. Now let's talk about prep time, because I think that's also really important. And a lot of good people that I speak to, and this is something that I believe in myself, that most debates are won during prep time. So most debates are going to be won during the first, one during or during prep. How effective your prep is, how good your prep is determines how you perform in that debate. And I think what a lot of teams miss out on during prep is having confines in which they can have the discussion for that particular debate. And I think that's really important, because it focuses your discussion. You focus what is on the most important issues of the debate without losing focus, derailing, not engaging with what the main issues are. My recommendation for prep times is usually you start the debate and you identify what type of motion is this. You might want to go through some of the main burdens of the debate. And then you might need to analyze some key examples that will help you get thinking. Once you've done that and you've identified those main things, I think it's important to go into individual prep time. Okay. And then once you've gone into the individual prep time or individual thinking, you go back and you feedback. And I think here it's really important to revisit your burden of proof. Okay, see that you've identified it correctly. See that, and then afterwards you use your burden of proof as a means to guide your discussion on prep. Okay, you need to guide everything that you're going to do. And I think that's really important because a lot of the time teams just generate a lot of arguments which often sound very good and interesting, but they might not necessarily give you the things that you really care about or the things that you are most interested in, or not even engage with the motion itself. So sometimes we have very clever arguments, but undirected clever arguments that have nothing to do with the debate actually don't have net benefit on us. Okay, once you've gone back and you've discussed your individual, what you thought about when you were thinking individually, I think it's really important to start constructing your case. So this is the balance of our case. This is where proposition is going to be going. This is where the proposition material goes. This is where what first speaker will be addressing. This is what second speaker will be addressing. Here's our policy. Here's our burden of proof. This is our problem, and so on. Once you've done that, I think it's really important for you to start preparing and writing your speeches. And I think during this time, any speakers who aren't in the round can start thinking of potential opposition lines to feed to the speakers, right? In this case, you want to make sure that you are prepared so that you can build up your arguments so that you don't get lost or teams don't beat you out in the debate. And I think it's really good to be preemptive in that sense so that you can identify the weakest parts of your own case and that you are prepared to engage with them during this speech writing process. And then finally, ideally, a speaker should walk you through their speech during the last 5 to 10 minutes, walk you through their speech. What is the material that is being generated? Make sure that there's no particular problems, and really important, make sure that the burden is clear and that you are ensuring that each part of the case matches or fulfills different parts of your burden of proof. Okay, that's going to be really, really important in order for you to win debates. Okay, the final thing that I want to talk about in this particular workshop relates to, it's been mentioned implicitly, but I think it's really important, is how motions might have an additional burden or an underlying assertion in them that requires added layers to your burden. And so this is, for example, in instances when the motions are set in a specific context, relate to a specific actor, or set in a specific place. So a good example of such a motion, and we've got a couple of those, is actually from last year. So last year, in round 4 of the Polish Schools Debating Championships, one of the motions was this House would privatize mining in Poland. Now, the important thing about that motion is that one part of it is about privatizing mining in general. But the motion has a restriction to it. And in this case, it is in Poland that you need to analyze your motion. So your problem can't just be about mining in general and public mining done under the state. It has to be about mining done under the state in Poland. The second thing is that your model needs to address Poland specifically. Whilst you might want to take references from models of other countries or examples there, you then need to use it and make sure it applies appropriately to Poland. The third part is that you have to then show how the model affects the specific harm in Poland. So it's not enough to talk about mining in general, but really about Poland and what it means for Polish people and so on. Then the next step is that there are positive benefits. It mitigates or prevents or reduces the harm in Poland. And then in the fourth step, you talk about the weighing and the comparison of benefits and harms. Now here, whilst your focus might be in Poland, you might want to make spin-off effects or secondary benefits and talk about them outside of Poland, what it could mean in other cases and in other places. But I think it's highly unlikely that that's going to be the case, at least for this particular motion. Okay. Another example of this would be this House, this is from 2018, PSDC. This House believes that all EU countries should adopt English as the principal language of instruction in schools. So here, you have to be very careful because the motion has very particular bounds. One is that it has to be in EU countries. And the second thing, we're talking about schools. So we might not necessarily be talking about tertiary level education, though that might be up for debate, but you're really talking about in schools particularly. And because that's vague, some people might want to tailor that or change it so that it's only primary schools or secondary schools. But other people might say, well, we're talking about both primary and secondary schools. So you have to be very careful about the specific nuances of the motion. Okay. And that wraps up this workshop on burdens. I hope you've found it very useful and very helpful. If you need help, please do not be afraid to approach myself or Piotr, because he's also quite knowledgeable with these things, the other CA. And hopefully all of the prep goes well. If you need additional resources, please feel free to contact me. I'm available through Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or email. And I wish you all a very pleasant Sunday, and I look forward to seeing you all at the Polish Schools Debating Championships 2020 in 3 weeks. Bye.